Hi everybody, I'm Mick O'Sulllivan. I'm chair of the London Fellow Housing Co-ops. I think we were a bit delayed, so I think we'll get started fairly immediately. With that, we can move on to the first item of the agenda. We've haven't received any items of A or B, but that can come later. Can we move on to the first item, which is dealing with the impact of the cost of living crisis?
Yeah.
Right. Paul, I think you're the speaker for that. So I'll give you this.
Right.
I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, firstly, thanks for the invite, and I'm really glad to be here because partly to bring solidarity from Unite, but in particular the Unite Housing Workers branch. And I think we have we see ourselves as having a particular responsibility to maintain and build links between the union and tenant organisations and housing campaigns. So I hope this introduction is just part of maintaining that link, really. And actually, I'm going to have to rush off after this to go to a demonstration which is calling for a rent freeze, which involves wide campaigns, council housing campaigns, housing association tenants, and so on. And I think we see that as a fundamental demand, really. We want to talk about how we can campaign on that, and hopefully not just now, but as an ongoing campaign. Now, I'm not going to say an enormous amount about the cost of living crisis in a way, because I think you don't need a barrage of statistics to know that we are in a cost of living crisis. You know, you don't need the statistics to realise that not only the very poor use food banks, but hospitals and employers have food banks simply because ordinary workers cannot get by. So that's the scale of it, and we probably all either use them or know people who are in that position. And but it's just worth underlining how serious that is, and that it's now very widespread. It isn't just the very poor that are affected. And of course, rent has a huge impact on housing costs generally on that. There's a statistic which curiously was reproduced in a report last week from the Tony Blair Foundation, which shows how since in 1979, you can have different figures actually, but rent was typically 10% of your income, and now it's typically 25, 30%, and often more, of course, particularly in London. And the report, in quite an interesting way, sets out how that relates to removing grant funding for social housing and shifting to market rates and some amelioration with housing benefits and so on. And that policy has essentially been a disaster. Of course, it is a policy that Tony Blair continued. And actually, if you look at other material from the Tony Blair Foundation, in case anyone was too hopeful that this was a sea change in Labour's policy, they actually have an exciting policy to increase home ownership to 70% at the time when people can't afford home ownership. Home ownership rates are going down in Britain and internationally, and actually 70% would be a higher level than Britain has ever had of home ownership. So there's a bit of a disconnect between them being forced to face the facts of the cost of living crisis and rent and the real reasons that lie behind that. And it is just worth underlining, I think, as well, that this has been a consistent fall in living standards, particularly since the global financial crash. So particularly since austerity, not Brexit, not any of the other factors that get thrown in. It's a long-term trend which has got worse. And that would be true in other advanced capitalist economies, but it is particularly true actually in Britain, where living standards have fallen particularly sharply. I mean, I'm not advocating that Andrew Neil becomes leader of the opposition, but in some ways he does a better job than the one we've got. And he was fingered a leading Tory politician this week, making the point that the achievement of this government has been to force workers onto similar living standards to Slovenia. That's the impact, and that's a quite a widely discussed statistic actually in the Financial Times and the likes. But oddly enough, they don't put that out when they're talking about strikes, when they're talking about the crisis in the NHS and so on. And that's the context. So, I mean, I think really what we've seen is quite a vicious clash on the part of the ruling class and its government. And we're seeing the beginnings of a fight back, firstly in the workplace. And I think that's a really significant change. We haven't seen these sort of battles for generations, really. But actually, there are also growing movements that we tried to, as a Unite branch, have tried to support of tenants. And I think housing is a really key issue in this crisis. So there have been, for example, organised tenants in housing associations who successfully resisted rent increases and particularly service charge increases by collective action, including withholding rent. In other words, that's a rent strike. Now, it's only small scale at the moment, but that's very significant that they've been able to chalk up those victories. And I hope that working with you is part of building a campaign of tenants to really push back. Now, I think it is worth saying that it's a cost of living crisis. It's a crisis for a lot of us, but profits are up. And you could, you know, we could spend ages giving statistic after statistic, but in particular, sorry to move on, I've lost my notes here. But in particular, and it's been in the news this week, hasn't it, that bank profits are rocketing up. And really, that's the other side of the coin of interest rates going up. Interest rates push up rents, push up the cost of living. They sound like bad news for most of us, but they don't sound like bad news for people whose income comes from owning things. That's the, you know, the basic point. The profits have even rocketed in the last 2 or 3 years. In other words, in this intense period of crisis when there isn't money for the NHS, there isn't money for basic services, we're told, actually bank profits are rocketing up. And we were talking about Sharon Graham earlier. Just quote Sharon Graham, who made the point that it's time the truth were told. Interest rates are putting the fear of death into households across Britain, but we know that at the same time they are delivering billions in excess profits to city banks. Our economy is broken, and nothing symbolises that better than the spectacle of politicians demanding pay cuts, real terms pay cuts from nurses, while doing nothing to get city noses out of the bank billions trough. And I think that does pose what the situation that we face is. And Sharon goes on to call for a windfall tax on the profits of banks. And I think that's an absolutely minimal demand that we should put. But actually, if you really want to devote the enormous resources that are present in a rich country like Britain, I think we should put the demand for nationalisation of the banks back on the agenda and direct resources, in particular, into refurbishing the housing stock and building new, genuinely affordable housing. Now, I've probably spoken quite long enough, but I just want to, there's a series of immediate issues that I think we should be fighting on. No evictions, for a start. This is the crisis period. Evictions were paused to a degree during the pandemic, but we're in a crisis again. Actually, evictions doubled over the last year. These are economic evictions. These are a product of workers being forced to pay for the crisis. So an immediate demand should be a moratorium on evictions. But also, we need to make the call for a return to proper grant funding of housing. And I think that this issue of grant funding of housing versus housing the organisations being weighed down by enormous interest payments, I think that's a key broad issue in housing. It applies in different ways. It applies if you're a shared owner paying an extortionate rent on the one side and now having your mortgage rates pushed up on the other side. It applies if you're a housing association tenant, and the way that housing associations have addressed this crisis is an absolute scandal, but they've acted as the mouthpiece really for the banks. They're massively in debt to the banks, and they see their top priority is ensuring that the banks get all the money to them, rather than supporting tenants of those organisations. So that they've argued where there's been a campaign for a rent freeze, there's been a campaign for rents to be held below the rate of inflation, and that the government have actually done that. But what was the response of housing associations? Well, they either called for a higher rent cap, or in the case of the G15, the big London housing associations, they called for no cap at all. They said it should be completely unregulated. So they're playing the role, as I say, of defending the banks. For many of you, will be linked to housing associations, and that, you know, poses a direct question for you. But really, the issue of the banks and borrowing and raising interest really applies across the board, doesn't it? And I think it was interesting that the New Economic Foundation, who actually is a branch we've worked closely with on these issues, put forward a detailed costed proposal for a complete rent freeze. And actually, when you do the figures, because of the money it would save in benefits and so on, it's actually not as expensive as you would think. You might have thought that housing associations and housing organisations and, you know, the sector that's supposed to represent social housing tenants would have come in behind that, but of course none of them did. None of them did. So that's telling, and I think what it points to is that tenant organisations, co-ops like yourselves, have a common interest with the labour movement in fighting on the immediate demands against rent increases, against evictions, but also for, you know, what Unite's talked about, a workers' economy. Now, I'll just leave you with a fairly detailed kind of specific point that you might want to consider, and the broader point. And the specific point is, this is quite a long resolution that we've put to the Unite Policy Conference. Now, some of you here may well be in Unite, and at the stage that's gone in, the resolutions for the policy conference will have gone in, but there will be a chance to amend it. And so keep in touch with us if you want to do that and chip in and amend it, because Unite's policy broadly on housing is very good and is for increased spending on social housing and so on. But there's a lot of issues that have come up more recently. So that's a 2-page resolution. You might, by the way, think there's huge gaps even in that, but there's a recommended word length for resolutions, and that's 3 times the recommended. So I think we're probably chancing our arms there, but you might be able to put in more points through amendments, and also just tell us what you think of it, if you disagree with it, whatever, so that we can sort of work together on developing a program. But I think the broader point is, we are at a point where there is a cost of living crisis. It's a real crisis. And there is a serious fight back now, you could say. If it's been a one-sided class war for a long time, there is a fight back. And that started where workers have economic power in workplaces. But it does have to continue over into wider campaigns, and in particular, I think, housing and tenant issues. So we're very keen to continue to work with you on that. That will pose political questions, and we will work. I mean, one of the value of that resolution is Unite will push that, for instance, within the Labour Party if it's adopted as policy. But I have to say also, there's a desperate need for workers' representatives. You know, we've got 2 sets of politicians that really represent the banks in different ways. We need our own voice. I think that's the other thing that we want to work with you towards.
Thanks for that, Paul. I'll open up for questions and comments. Does anybody want? Martin?
Well, just to the speaker, really. You can have an easy win on us. We froze our rents for the last 2 years.
Brilliant.
Because we're our own boss.
Yeah, yeah.
Anybody else want to? Greg?
Paul, hopefully you or Noel can forward that to me.
Yeah.
And we'll put it on the Facebook bit so I can be part of the discussion. Need it by email, otherwise I've got to type it all again. But just thinking back 100, 120 years ago, when Labour was getting a voice to represent working people in this country. Across Europe, the unions were involved in setting up their own housing co-ops and building housing for working people. Where we, in this country, we moved over towards the building societies movement and individual homes, and they set up banks too, I think. And that whole thing of having an economy that was separate to the one run by the banks, not as a sort of exchange economy, but just where the cash would be circulated within cooperative shops, lent by cooperative banks, earned by cooperative workers. We're trying to see the possibilities of that with co-ops lending to co-ops to develop some new housing. It's not on a very big scale, but it's just showing that it can work. Do you think Unite's got a role in that? In certain, I just spoke to some of your officers some years ago about whether there'll be that interest, because we've got this whole custom build arrangement within the GLA, building homes the London way, and the possibility of getting service plots that we could start building on. So Paul Kershaw.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's right.
Over to you, Paul.
Oh, so you want me to come back? Yeah, sure. I mean, on that last point, it is true that there's been different ways forward for the labour movement and housing. I guess in Britain, the demand was council housing, coming out, from the rent strikes in Glasgow before, and the first Labour government after that. And of course, that's to a dreadful extent being unwound, but that is the demand. And I think that's still a relevant demand because that does cut out the dominance of finance. And actually it's interesting when this move towards privately financed social housing was being developed, which is now decades ago, of course. The National Audit Commission did an assessment of the relative cost of funding through borrowing in banks and grant funding and using the public borrowing, and actually concluded that grant funding was enormously cheaper.
Yeah.
It also concluded that it was better to use private finance, and this was apparently because that would make housing more accountable and more, the idea was there was these small, cuddly housing associations and so on. Well, don't think anyone would really make that argument now, would they?
No.
So that's been completely subverted, and I think it makes the case for grant funding, but then democratic control. This is the point we have to emphasize, and that's been made terribly clear by recent experience. The classic one really is Grenfell, isn't it, where the tenants organisation pointed to the virus, and not only they weren't actually ignored, they were threatened with legal action. That's the way it's run now. On your point about co-op housing, it's true that or the labour movement initiating housing. I mean, in Europe that was done, wasn't it? You go around Amsterdam, there's one of the housing associations that's got a sort of a logo, which is basically a hammer and sickle. You can see around the place. I saw it before I knew the history, and I thought, it's strange. Although sadly, my understanding is that's one of the their housing associations, and which did provide most of the social housing, had a financial crisis because they'd been tied up with borrowing with the banks, and they had a similar financial crisis to what a lot of the British housing associations had. The British ones in the financial crash narrowly escaped going under. The ones in Amsterdam and the Netherlands didn't. And a lot of them were broken up. So unfortunately, you see that logo, and it's owned by a bank. Now, and that's the problem. That we really have to challenge these global forces. I don't know what role Unite could play in the here and now on that. What I would say is I think we should be open to looking at what assistance and what positive role Unite could play. I think the other point was about and by the way, that there may well be detailed points around those issues that could go into Unite's policy and wouldn't be covered in there, partly because we've already massively over the word limit, so that we'd welcome other people in Unite putting in more. But the final point is the key point, really. You can do a rent freeze for now, great. So why can't these big professionally run housing associations do a rent freeze? And it's not because they haven't made surpluses, and they actually make their operating surpluses are actually larger, consistently larger than the likes of Barratt's and so on, the speculative builders, which are often pointed to as profiteering. Of course, they will say they divert those profits or that surplus to their social purpose of building more homes, but you have to say they are responsible for a net loss of social rented housing. So what social purpose is that? What they're actually doing is circulating capital on behalf of the banks and the financial institutions.
Any other questions? Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, can I welcome the comments which have just been made? I think those of us who are various bodies and organisations trying to make radical change inside not only the Labour Party but also elsewhere, find it very concerning that we are forever having to respond to an ever worsening situation. And it's not just the banks. I think the City of London is one of the worst offenders in relationship to profits, and there are probably more oligarchies involved in the City of London, and most people are probably aware that your Evening Standard is owned by one of them, who happens to be in the House of Lords. You just couldn't make this up, could you? So I think I welcome that particular report. I have a look at the New Economics Foundation model, which is coming. I'm part of the Co-op Innovation Group, which is seeking to develop new innovations in relationship to cooperative, the cooperative in general. And there's a big surge now for community wealth building throughout this country, not just the Preston model, but other models which are being developed as well. I think there is that need to support people in relationship to rents, rights. I think those are the sort of areas which are already manifesting themselves. And I think what's got even worse is that I think we've all in local authority. I've been a local authority member for 48 years. At various different levels, and I've been able to influence hopefully at the local government level as well as in policy. But I think what has now come very much forward is the attitude of sometimes even local authorities, housing associations, to mould and dampness. The 2-year-old boy that died in Rochdale, his butt, and I get all the info coming in. It was an astonishing level of potential disaster of people's death and misery. And it's not just about the profits now that people are making and the ignorance that even some local Labour authorities are manifesting themselves, is that they're not even dealing with the issues on the ground. And that is now. But so from the council housing group, which I'm also a member of, which we've got our AGM shortly, it was last week. I lose track of what's going on sometimes. I think we need to operate all together in trying to change, because there's an urgency and there's real problems, not only in housing and mortgages being called in at an alarming rate in the next few weeks, only before the end of the financial year. But the conditions in housing, whether it's in the private rented sector or even in the council housing sector, is becoming very stark. as we speak. So it is a big movement that we could actually make and bring forward. And if that means there has to be actions of various things within inside the Labour Party, then so be it, as far as I'm concerned.
Niall?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for the introduction. It's been very stimulating. I mean, the issue of austerity. I mean, as Paul said, we don't need lots of figures, facts and figures. They are astounding when you hear them. But because we're all living through it. I mean, at my house, which is a co-op house, obviously, on our street, just 4 doors down, there's a food bank. And now, on a Saturday morning, there's just a queue of people that come all the way past our house. It must be at least 300-400 yards long. And I think it's a lot of them are students, Asian students who were caught out, remember, during COVID, because they're sort of stuck in Britain and not getting funds and so on. So there's a lot of local stuff done to help them. But their condition's still terrible. So they're at that place twice a week. And it's just one of, I think, on that road, Catherine Road, very long road in Newham. And it's about a mile long. It connects Romford Road and Barking Road. I think there's at least 3 food banks just on that road itself. It just shows the desperation people face. And then it's not just poor people, is it, or people with less means. Like my partner works at PCS, the Civil Servants Union, and she was very involved in the strike that they were taking part in a week or so ago in the London area. And she was saying, there's young workers, PCS workers coming out who are actually quite high up on their grades. The people have been fast-tracked from elite universities to some of the top jobs. And just on their at a level before they get into management. But she says they're paying anything between, like, young people with maybe 1 room or a shared house or something, they can be paying up to £1,800 a month on rent. So it's about half their income or a huge chunk of it. It's like the point Paul made about how much rent we were paying in the past compared to now. So even what looks like a good wage, but if it's London in particular, once you take away the rent, you're already living on not much money to get you through the rest of the month. And then, of course, we see that the energy hike, that's going to take place, unless the Tories do a U-turn, which might happen. But that's going to be a big hike again in April, which is going to hit everybody's pockets. I mean, on the rent freeze issue, I mean, we in most co-ops, we can decide ourselves. We set our own rents, and obviously, we had this discussion earlier this week in our management committee, and we've got a managing agent, and who were not strongly, but encouraging us to go for the 7%. And that managing agent, they're actually owned by a housing association now. So you can see where the thinking's coming from and where the pressure's coming from. And we resisted that, one, because our own members they kept making a big thing about this is the amount you will lose out each year, whatever it was, £30,000. If you don't raise it by 7% this year, so that's a bit of you could say raise it by 50%, look how much we lose over the next year. But the point is our members are suffering because of inflation. And that comes out of lockdown. Lots of people lost their jobs, are working part-time now. And as Paul was saying, we voluntarily, working people, run our co-ops. We have the books open. We know exactly what's going in, what's going out. We're not going to be reckless and stupid. If there was like no money or hardly any money for maintenance and repairs or some important works that needs to be done, you'd have to maybe have a hard discussion of members and say, well, we need to raise it a bit. We need to raise it by this amount to make sure we cover that. We're not in that situation at the moment. In our housing co-op, in particular, all our mortgages will be paid off next month at the end of March. So we own all our properties. We'll no longer have mortgages, which obviously been going down in scale anyway, but will no longer be there. But that's something to factor into it. But the point I think with our housing co-ops is that we're open and transparent to our own members. There's no hiding things behind, we know how the housing associations work. So, but it might be more difficult. I don't know. Maybe people are in housing co-ops here who are owned by council, if their stock is owned by a council. Are they coming under pressure? Or a housing association? Do they feel pressure? Maybe, people want to come in and say what that's like or what sort of discussions. I'd be interested to hear what discussions co-ops have had internally on the rent freeze issue. I think because you're always, particularly those on management committees, you have to deal with the sums and have to deal with the repairs and maintenance. We're always a bit worried that we'll have enough in reserves to make sure we cover our costs. But the point is that we can have that sort of logical, rational discussion ourselves as members and come to a conclusion on it. Just on the interesting points, I think that Greg was mentioning and Paul on housing co-ops and how they developed on the continent compared to here. There was a bit of a divergence, wasn't there, the way that that developed. It's the same in Ireland. Ireland would be the same as here as well. But and co-ops over there sort of developed much more in agriculture and shops as you've had here. But it's a mixed picture, isn't it? You go to some of the countries on the continent, because it's not all our type of housing co-ops that exist, and they've changed over the years. I mean, I have been over in Copenhagen. My partner's nephew lives there. He lives in a housing co-op, and it's a very old building. It's a tiny little flat, and they have to go down to the basement for like basically communal showers and so on. So that still exists, and it's right in the centre of the city. So it's a great location. But what's been happening, I don't know when the change took place, but over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, he was telling me that they now have a policy that you can apply in a long waiting list, or you can be sort of fast tracked if you're prepared to put a stake. In other words, you're prepared to put a big chunk of money into the housing co-op. And so, of course, it leans itself towards people with more money, more middle class people. And then what they're doing, what they're allowing them to do when they move in, they are tiny flats, but you can just about get shower units put into them. So people with more money and resources, they're already removing themselves and everybody else in the co-op. It's like a big building block, not, it's like all separate flats. So you can see the way things have moved along. And I think they were set up initially, as Greg was saying, I think by the Social Democratic Party and members probably in the turn of the last century. They were a very good step forward. It was like clean living and proper sewage and decent housing and so on. And they survived for decades. But I think like a lot of this state housing, like we saw in, in Eastern Europe, the old bloc, a lot of that would have been co-op housing, and then were taken over by the Communist Party in the 1940s and 50s, and sort of kept as co-op housing to some degree. But after the 1990s, a lot of that's just gone. I think it's just been sold off, privatised, or the type of co-op housing that exists might be a bit like the Copenhagen model. So we're quite lucky in a sense the models we have here, because it's mutual. We own our, not in every case, but in many cases we own our own properties. I just finished on the opportunities, because I agree with the point Greg was making, and Paul, I think that there's more of an openness now to alternative economies. People are much more talking about socialism, but it's also people want to be practical and they want something that works now, and they are looking towards cooperatives and so on. And I can't remember the name it's now called, but there's been a change, hasn't there? The worker cooperatives have branched out on their own, haven't they? I think over the last few months, there might even have been a formal partner of the Ways from the other co-op body they were part of. And I can't remember what new name they've given themselves, but they do seem a bit more, it seems a bit more like they're determined to really organise in the workplace and they don't want to be connected, I think, with the big co-op shop and sort of concerned. They're worried about that. So probably a healthy development, I think. But we should see a bit maybe what they're up to if they're having meetings and linking up a bit with those. And another thing I've got involved in the last year or so is called Union Co-ops UK. And that brings together academics, people from different sort of cooperative backgrounds. I've been there, representing the head as well. And that's a good development. And the idea behind that is that there has been far too long historically this sort of division between unions and worker cooperatives and other type of cooperatives. And it's more advanced in America. I think there's been a real push to sort of integrate them much more. In the United States, I think this is where the idea comes from. So this Union Co-ops UK, it's just been launched really properly in the last year. And the idea is to push into the trade union movement, into the co-op movement, and trying to explain to both sides, the benefits obviously of unions, we all know them, and also the benefits of cooperatives. And then there's a wider discussion, which I'm not time to go into now, which has been alluded to. I think we all like the idea of co-ops and living in them, or can they themselves evolve into a new society? Or there's the old question, and there's also the issue, of course, of successful co-ops and economy of scale. You get to a certain size and the market pressures become enormous. The pressures to adapt to the market economy, to start having CEOs. We've all seen it in different spheres. And there's been quite big cases of it in Europe, like the Mandragon and so on, which caused them problems in the past. And I think those are always problems you're going to have when you're a smaller part of an economy, with an economy as a market economy. But to me, a socialist economy is one where people would work cooperatively. And I think in its microcosm, the fact like a co-op like ours, which people may know, it's had its problems, but we've been around since the early 1980s. We're now owning all our properties within a month. So in that sense, we've staggered through quite hostile periods when the governments were not giving co-ops at all, particularly housing co-ops. All the grants went, an attempt, pushing us to sell off our assets and so on. We withstood all that. And what strikes me, it's not the answer to everything, obviously. It's not an answer to the housing crisis as a whole. That would take council housing building, in my opinion. But what co-ops do show is that working class people can run their own lives. They can run their own housing. And that can be done. And if there is a new generation of council housing was to be built, got to think a lot more about the rights of tenants and how they run them. And the good examples of cooperatives is something to learn from that, I think. So there's lots of lessons come out of it.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, Wilfred, you wanted to come in?
I think we've got one.
Well, I will have to leave shortly. I just wanted to come back on the pension funds investing in affordable housing or lower rent-based housing, which is a concept that's very common on the continent across many countries. And we had an attempt like 12, 13 years ago, when we actually went as far as talking to pension funds like British Airways, which was at that time one of the biggest pension funds in the United Kingdom. We didn't succeed because there were all sorts of resistance cropping up, basically city people and interests. But I think it might be worth looking at that again, because we, as Paul said, we are facing a fundamental crisis, and we need to look at solutions on a fundamental level. And pension funds investing in housing would do two things. It could raise standards in housing, and it obviously would deliver rents on an affordable basis. I mean, I just can look back on my own situation. My children, my daughter has come back from abroad and working here, and together with her boyfriend, she almost spends her income on paying rent on a flat in Battersea. Her boyfriend, who is in his first job, he has a decent salary, but he is also lumbered with some debts from university. So there is, no chance for them to even create a new depot for getting their own place as promised by the Conservative Party and different shared ownership schemes, which turn out to be more or less scams, where people are trapped in even more debt and lose everything they have. So I think the Cooperative Party, Labour Party needs to look into really alternatives to change things fundamentally. I don't know what people think here on trying again, speaking with pension funds.
I'll come in a bit on that, because I sit on a board of a pension fund, a trustee of a council pension fund. And a few years back, we tried to look into this. And we had a meeting of various pension fund trustees and various other people. And what we found was that we couldn't invest, given that climate, we couldn't invest in it because the returns were not large enough for us to justify that to our members, that we could invest this money in that. But I think it's something that needs to be revisited constantly, because I think the circumstances will change from that. when we talk about the cost of living, we should know it's not just rent, it's also the utilities bills.
Yeah.
It's electricity, it's the gas, it's
Yep.
it's even the broadband these days, which broadband companies are increasing way beyond the rate of inflation. No good reason. There's the Thames Water, I suppose, in London, who's upping its fees as well. And I think we need to look at, last year we spent an awful lot of time looking into retrofit, looking into the green agenda. We should sort of keep in mind that there's a few things housing co-ops can do, especially if they own their own property. Look at a program, if you haven't done already, of putting double glazing or triple glazing, windows and doors into your property, looking on making them safe. Look at, again, look at solar panels. The price of solar panels is going to drop by something like 25% this year. Or so it's not 50%, I was told in one case, but it will mean that these things become viable. Might look at giving their tenants that, look at batteries, look at all the stuff we can do to reduce the cost of renting or owning a home outside of the rent. Now, rent increases are up to individual co-ops. If the rent is already low, you might have to increase it. But all the housing associations, there's a cap put on rent increases to 7%. All the big housing associations are going up to the max on that cap. Co-ops, we don't have to. We can keep it a little bit lower. Or maybe as, you know, my co-op had a rent freeze. I don't know what's going to happen this year, but I should say rent freeze help people out. There's another thing I found out, which was really bizarre. But if you're the Department of Work and Pensions is now demanding a EPC rating for properties where tenants are trying to claim their warm homes allowance. So if you have tenants, old age pensioners, people on low income, it might be an idea to get an EPC rating for your properties if you haven't done it already. Current one. With that, I'll hand over to Paul. Do you want comments or anything on that stuff?
Well, it's been a really interesting discussion for me, actually. To start on, I haven't got an answer about pension funds. It's interesting what you said about not actually delivering a return. I think that's a rent that you would want to charge. And I think if you were to trace one view, you could to trace what's happened in housing policy, certainly over the last decade or more, has been, what does BlackRock want?
Yeah.
And basically that set the policy at each stage. You know, they were, same guy was advisor to George Osborne, and then George Osborne got this incredibly well-paid job, didn't he, as an advisor to BlackRock, and it's just a sort of revolving door process. But they like the idea of investing in what they see as affordable housing, what they call affordable housing. And they've done that in Britain. Actually, we've linked with housing campaigners in Spain and around Europe, and they have very much the same issues as us, just different institutional setups. And it's because BlackRock is influencing their housing policy, or not just BlackRock, I'm picking on BlackRock. And they quite like affordable housing as it's been, because it's a steady income. It's absolutely safe. It's far better than doing something risky like investing in a useful product that someone might make. You just sit on it as an investment. But they want to know how those organisations are being run, and that, if you want the reason why the culture of housing association has changed, it's because of that. Actually, when we negotiate on pay, whereas other employers would say, no, we want to give loads of profits to our shareholders, and we say, no, we don't like that. Housing associations say, oh no, we've got a covenant here, so you can't talk about that. And the covenant is basically an agreement with the banks as to how they'll run the organisation and how they'll absolutely guarantee that they get their money. You know, so that's what lies behind. That's the danger of trying to have finance gets its tentacles into social housing organisations. Absolutely agree about the points about mould and dampness. We could have spent the whole discussion really on that. But again, just at the risk of being repetitive, really, housing associations and councils have had these fat surpluses, operating surpluses. That means the money that they collect from you or from renters is more than the money they spend on workers going out to repair things. They're not installing gold bath taps. That's not the explanation for rents. Neither are they paying fantastic wages.
Yeah.
They get a surplus. And where does that go? That's been the priority, really. Goes to the banks and so on. And that's really the explanation for the disrepair in social housing. That's you know, without being repetitive, I'm afraid that is just an overwhelming factor of the situation. And just a detailed point that I think is relevant and is a particular example that housing co-ops have shown, helped demonstrate, is this question of economies of scale in housing management. That I think there really isn't evidence that bigger is better, you know, and actually there's evidence that beyond a certain point, bigger tends to get worse because it's more remote. That doesn't mean, by the way, that there isn't an overwhelming logic why housing associations and social housing organisations have got bigger. Because if you want to be playing financial derivatives, engaging with BlackRock and so on, you do want to be big. You want to be engaging in, you know, regeneration schemes. You're dealing with big developers. You do want to be big, but that's the reason. It's not because it's going to deliver a better service. So it's again a bit repetitive. It is the big financial institutions. And just to finish, I think the point I take away from this is the point that has been made, that housing co-ops and the cooperative movement demonstrate what working class people are capable of.
Yeah.
We don't actually need, you know, it's the point that was made about the pandemic, isn't it? That all the chief executives and the masters of the universe in the city stay at home. The world doesn't stop. It's us that really run things. And so all power to you in that. And I hope that we can maintain a relationship actually in campaigning around the vital issues of housing and the cost of living crisis. So
Thanks for that, Paul.
Thanks.
Just one thing before you go. You mentioned the Unite Policy Conference. When is it on? Where is it on? And how can people come to it?
It's in. I'll send you all the details.
Yeah.
It's in Brighton.
Yeah.
It's in June or July.
Right.
It's in the summer. The next stage of the process is amendments to resolutions, which means it's not too late.
Right.
If anyone's involved in Unite, but definitely I think we should try and, I'm in favour of having a fringe meeting or something now. We're very keen to involve yourselves in that.
Yeah.
To highlight the issue, because I think it's not, we're not pushing here at a closed door. There's a real openness within the union, understanding this is a completely vital issue for us, that's not been taken up by the politicians.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
So we'll keep in touch.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks
Thanks.
for coming. Yeah. Let's not rush off. With that, and we will be in touch about that, and maybe some sort of joint forum or something later on in the year. We now come to item 2, acting as a voice for co-ops and community-led housing through the London Housing Panel. And over to you, Greg.
I'll just rename that again. That was, you had your moment of fame very quickly there.
Point about workers during COVID. The society was held together by the people who were paid to leave.
Yeah.
The higher paid, that's already iterated there. The higher paid jobs weren't necessary to keep the country running. What we needed were the worst paid people. They were the ones that we needed the most.
Yeah. Your plumbers, your
well,
electricians, your
drivers,
Refuse workers.
refuse workers, all public.
Yeah. And then they get kicked in the teeth.
Well, just again, just one point about the housing associations. When you look at their boards and when you look at the senior management, they're all public school educated predominantly. It's been taken over by another class who have no clue whatsoever what it's like to live in social housing. They never have, never will. But they are also interested in increasing their salaries. You know, some of them are paying vast quantity, $500,000 a year.
Yeah, the fundamental point is who owns the wealth of this country. It is, you know, the majority develop the wealth for the few,
Yeah,
but not the many.
yes.
It's as simple as that, you know. I'll tell you a bit of a funny, because when one of our colleagues on the council house group became a parliamentary candidate down in Cornwall, it was almost at the same time that the Prince of Wales, who isn't endorsed by the Welsh Paul, I'll tell you that. Also, he got and actually became Duke of Cornwall. Do you remember? Yeah. He inherited 55,000 acres and 20 million. So I sent an email to her and I said, right, you're looking for social housing in Cornwall. Maybe there's somebody you ought to have a chat with who can actually not only give you the land, but also pay. But of course, nothing happened. What funny,
Okay, I've got this slot here to talk to you a bit about the work we do with the London Housing Panel, and I'm aware that I keep trying to sort of raise some interest, and it seems to be like this is the thing that Greg goes off and do, and I'm trying to persuade people that this is actually one of the bigger things. It's a bit of a coup for London Federation of Housing Co-ops, in that we've got an inside seat on some of the stuff going on with GLA officers, and that we need to, but it takes quite a bit of work, and it's something we need to work out how to leverage to our advantage. Yeah. So if we get one thing started, we run with it and see it through. So well, so the London Housing Panel was set up as a way of getting like a collective voice for different community and voluntary sector groups in London, specifically on things around housing. And these are the people that are on it now. It keeps moving towards looking at minorities, but it's got an overall focus for everyone that's in any sort of disadvantaged situation, which isn't the way I'd like to put it. It includes any form of social housing too. You can have the slides from this now. You don't, I mean, take photos by all means, but it's so you can see down the list. I assume the list is big enough for everyone to see. Yeah. The idea is that there is feedback on all of the issues where things start to happen and the politicians get told that everything's going well, and people at the bottom are going, oi, you know, this is the way it's affecting me. And this is the way that policy that sounds so wonderful excludes me. This is why shared ownership schemes are appalling, because this is how they work in practice. You know, this is where they're holding off the bailiffs because the system doesn't work in the way that people intended. Or these are the people that don't have access to it. Or you're excluding these people by doing that. So, but there's also the element of these are the things that we are doing, and these are areas that should be not just supported by the voluntary sector, but to sort of build on those sorts of partnerships. Am I making sense so far? Great. Now, the question of how we fit in, we've got these 15 groups, which includes the London Federation of Housing Co-ops. Martin's one of our representative, the London Tenants Federation. There are all of those others. We sit together as the London Housing Panel, and that is serviced by a group called Trust for London, who part fund it. They provide it's a charity that provides a lot of support for groups without a voice in housing. And then there's also input from the GLA and the Mayor's office. So it's the only grant funding that London Fed's had in sort of 25 years. But we're not doing it for the money. It's the fact that because it's funded, it's an official part of the, yeah. So £1,000 a year, and it's not, we're not exactly going to achieve too much from it. It was agreed that I'd get paid that money a while back, but it's been going into the funds anyway, so there's no gravy train or anything. But before anyone says it, but the chair of the London Housing Panel then sits on the Mayor's Housing Committee with Homes for Londoners. You may have heard of Homes for Londoners. Yeah, he's got offices down in near the King George V docks. So I'm not going to say we've got a massive voice, but it is an official voice. It's officially part of the process. And when it was nearly axed last year, a lot of the GLA members intervened to say, no, we think this voice is important, because you can't talk about consultation and then get rid of the people that you consult with. So there's a list of things that we're officially down to do, but looking at them, I'm not going to read these out, but essentially they see it as a panel that will reflect on their policies and give them feedback from the various groups, and just point up, make useful comments in passing, as it were. Personally, if you know me, I'll try and find my own things to try and leverage through. Between us and London Tenants Fed there, we are strongly saying that if you're going to make promises about housing, or if developers make promises about housing and developments, there needs to be a way of actually looking at the end of the process and say, did you do what you said you'd do? Both anecdotally and through the wider statistics. You know how Sharon loves her statistics. But we also try and influence GLA policy, so we get early access to an awful lot of the policies before they go out to consultation with others, and get to try and tweak the wording, add in areas they hadn't thought about, suggest some areas are not quite as helpful as they might be. It's amazing the sorts of things that get into these documents. You think, where's this person been for the last 20 years? But we also try and work with two things. One is some of the other people on the groups. We've all got similar aims, and it's any time you've got a networking situation like that, you're silly not to try and build on it.
Always.
And where we've got projects that we're trying to push across, obviously we've got contact with the relevant GLA officers, so continue trying to get their support, hearing where there is other bits where you might get a chisel in or a lever in or a crowbar to try and get a bit more influence. These are all the sorts of things that I've got the emphasis on. That makes sense. It's not quite the same, and often there's a continual pushback. We've done a lot of work on homeless temporary accommodation, and we'll just done there. Temporary accommodation and what they call EDI, about equalities areas, making sure that builders have people from a range of backgrounds, ethnic groups within their projects. It's easy to drift away from the needs of most Londoners. There's the overarching issue is a problem with social housing, especially for younger people. And we've got
old gits like me.
There's an element of you don't want to be forced out of your homes at the end of your working life when you've got no way of actually doing anything about it. You don't want to be isolated and not have the opportunities in younger life. That means you never get the job opportunity, you never get the homes. Now we have tried doing some work with people like Action on Empty Homes, Generation Rent, and a couple of other groups like Flat Justice that TfL have put us in touch with. We've got a little working group on short life housing, and obviously we've got the links within other short life groups and aspiring groups of guardians. The trouble has been that the COVID, it slowed meeting, it slowed doing anything, it sapped so much energy. Some of those things that we've been trying to do it's just been difficult to keep up the energy. And the whole COVID thing also distracted the GLA from doing the sorts of projects that we're trying to get moving along. So yeah, I've been doing it on I think 4 years now, coming up for 5 on the London Housing Panel. things that were making progress just seem to have slipped back a bit. We're trying to get the sorts of things we've been trying to get support from as projects are any sort of pilot for community-led housing projects. And Mick, we've been trying to do this for 10 years now.
Yeah.
This is the whole background to where we've got co-ops lending money to other co-ops. But we're seeing it on such a small scale. And it's highlighting, one of the things we're doing the whole time is highlighting the obstacles. We have councils and the GLA and even central government putting forward plans and ways that public property can be sold off in small parcels so community-led groups can actually pick them up and run on a local basis. But those things are not working, and they're not working for systemic reasons because of so it's constantly trying to feed back in an informed way. This is why these projects fail. It's not because they're not viable, it's because of these hurdles and these obstacles. And part of the way of doing that has been either saying it directly or saying we need to actually research before we do this consultation on how we should move forward on this in the mayor's plan. We need to look at what the obstacles are so that that can be part of the consultation, and then point people towards all of these groups who can then say, yeah, we're doing really well. Council officers stopped us. Council officers stopped us. It was revalued and didn't work. Or we were given a chocolate teapot. The land that we were given just wasn't suitable. Or we tried for, all of these things, or just, I can talk about more of these things. I've spoken about these things at other times, but these are the issues we can bring up directly with the officers to try and change the way that they're monitored and looked at moving forwards. And Tom Copley comes along to every meeting, the Deputy Mayor for London. So it doesn't hurt to be on first name terms with everybody. I mean, London Fed, when you look at, we've got a dozen people here today. And it's our first one back face to face. And I'm really pleased with that. But it does mean that with the amount of influence we've got, we're batting above our weight when compared with the 30 or 40 or 50 people that we were getting a few years ago. It's on the work list. It's a long way down the work list, but it's on the work list for some council officers to do, like working arrangements for short life co-ops instead of guardians, because people have picked up that guardians are a massive risk to the public purse and also a massive, very poor quality housing that's unregulated. So providing an it's like pushing an open door. It's just not high enough on anybody's list. So part of the role of this is keeping it on the list. Plenty of challenges. As a group, as the panel, are expected to represent all of the different diverse community groups across London. We do that to an extent through recruitment. At the moment, we're recruiting other people that represent relatively young people after another group's dropped out. We represent all forms of community co-op tenant-led housing. So we need to be throwing the doors open to like the co-housing groups, the different, the types of co-ops we don't always talk to quite so much. Community-led housing trusts are our bag too, even though they've got their own forms of publicity. The challenge is, as I said before, keep the projects on the agenda on projects and not just sitting down and answering questions that the GLA officers bring to us. It's a challenge to keep momentum. A lot of campaigning groups expect a response in a few months. Everything on this is working on like mayor's plans 5 years apart. It's about working on officers, building relationships. Keeping that going is a challenge. We need to be very clear on the information that we're demanding from the GLA to keep them to account. We can't be asking for things that we're not going to use, but then we need to have the capacity to actually sit down and go through all of those, what we're getting back from it. If we're getting nothing back from it, then we've asked for the wrong information. There's always finding ways. Need to find that. I talked about the obstacles, finding the ways to explain it. When you've got someone who's immensely proud of a project, explaining as nicely and supportively as possible why it's a crock of shit. And then so much of the information we've got is embargoed. I'm supposed to be feeding back our views on the rent increases, the rent caps, on different forms of planning changes, but I'm not supposed to publicise it. How am I supposed to feedback from our organisation on something I'm not really supposed to be sharing with everyone? As an exec, we don't meet that often. You know, there needs to be ways of actually making it so this is the views of London Fed of housing co-ops, not the London Fed of Greg. Do you know what I mean? And that's an ongoing challenge. This is the list of what the LHP says of the challenge. Did I skip one? Oh, these are the 5 working groups that we're working on. Seeing people's eyes, I think I've got to get close to wrapping up. I'm on the housing supply group and on the voice on housing groups. Trying to be on all 5 would just be reproducing the main panel. So within the housing supply, obviously we keep pushing the co-op model, but it's about monitoring the housing supply as well and monitoring the premises that are made. And we do have access to the London Planning Hub, which allows you to look at all the sort of what's been produced, but that's being updated. The new data won't be uploaded till March of this year. So since the last of the summer, we've been the data and there's like a year, 18 months old. So it's been an element of waiting for the new stuff before we put the energy in on figuring out how it all works. But it's like, you want this much information and you offered that much. That coping with it, it's difficult. Voice on housing is what it says it is. I'm not sure that we've achieved masses, but we have done a lot of this on this EDI stuff, trying to make sure that developers are required to involve a range of Londoners and they just don't import a load of people down from Newcastle to work, you know, whatever. So it supports Londoners. We keep putting well, possibly the mayor's doesn't use the central government's version of affordable housing. He talks about truly affordable housing. That's possibly one of effects of the London Housing Panel. It doesn't sound much, but it is an important philosophical difference. That, do you know what I mean? It's something we said we haven't got them to use the word social housing all the time, but the GLA is not. It only talks about shared ownership because it's required to. We've won the argument that it's not a good model the way it's pressed at the moment. And there are a few collaborations going on about temporary accommodation. Let's see where they get to, but yeah, it's positive. And in terms of what's next, we need to sort out what projects we're going to keep trying to push forwards. Me just saying that we need a pilot isn't doing enough at the moment. We've got a lot of data crunching to do with those spreadsheets when we get them. We need to keep identifying the results of the unintended consequences where people think that pushing community-led housing as community land trusts and then prevent housing co-ops and groups of local people from applying. We've got to be there to say, no, this is not achieving what was meant to achieve. And this community land trust is a community-based housing association that's working outside of its community. Or, you know, this way of bidding prevents the people that live next to it winning the bid. And succession. You can't be relying on one person. There need to be other people getting involved, not necessarily doing all of it, doing part of it. Yeah, and Someone needs to replace me soon. I've been on it for 5 years. I've been on it exec for best part of
We're all getting
15
old,
years.
mate.
Well, it's not just that, but I might be around less. I'll stay involved from a distance, but it really needs to be someone who's
Doesn't work.
involved in things. Anyway, I hope I've convinced you that this London Housing Panel stuff is doing some good and it's worth our time being involved. And possibly, what the opportunities are going forwards. I will just see if
Any questions for Greg? Barry, did you have your hand up? No.
Yeah, how often does it actually meet, Greg? I mean, practically, do you have to go to the GLA? And meet?
it varies between 3 and 4 times a year for the panel. And that meets just off of Bishopsgate. Although you can attend it virtually. The working group meetings all meet at a different rate. So once every couple of months. But I mean, that varies. If there's a specific agenda to build up to do something, people might meet monthly, but other times it might just be a separate working group in between the main 3 or 4 times a year panel meetings. I think we're on 3 times a year at the moment. We were on 4 times a year last year.
Just another couple of questions. Does it at any point, I mean, you say that it's like a, it's, as far as the mayor's office is concerned, it's like a 5-year thing. It's not, or whatever, it's not just a short term. But do they
The London plan comes out once every 4 to 5 years.
Right. Okay. And when was the last one then? When was that last one published?
3 years ago, I think.
Right. So it was June next year or so.
It's a long. First of all, you have the social housing market assessments and the SHMA and the SHLA. There's a consultation on about whether they're collecting the right information, whether they've got the right information, whether it's interpreted right. There's a step-by-step, rigorous, robust, relentless a series of steps to collect the information, present the objects, consult on them, and then have a public examination. And even then it might be changed and have things that the mayor wanted taken out.
Just my last question. What's the thinking behind having an embargo and some of the information?
Same embargo you have for any organisation. If the GLA hasn't released something yet and it's giving you early access, it means it's not the version that they're actually ready to put out to the public. But that makes it difficult for me to collect ideas. Some organisation is easy. You take it back to the office and everyone in the office gets a look. When a lot of your communication is through a Facebook group, or I can email it to people with several people on the exec, some more engaged than the others, and they might share it with somebody else. It's just very easy to lose control. And people in those sorts of organisations, like the GLA, are more sensitive to things getting out early than we might be. We might not see it as a big deal, but when other things have been more contentious and have led to a scandal, organisationally, they try to. So if we want to keep getting the information early, we need to respect that. But there's forever this thing of, how do we share it with our groups? How do I get the views of co-ops if I can't ask them, if I can't share it? And that's one of those ongoing things we're battling with. And it's possibly why you've got less of a feel of what I'm doing, because I've not always been able to share what I'm doing when I want to. Plus, of course, the bit that you spend your time getting ready for the meeting the few days before the meeting, rather than even if you've got the information 3 weeks before, you focus on what you've got to do next. You focus on the job in front of you, and by the time I'm actually looking at it, it's I should have shared this. I mean, I've shared the bit about there's the GLA stakeholder event, and there is a long part of this lead in. There's dealing with stakeholder groups and there's dealing with partner groups. We're arguing that the London Housing Panel as partner groups, but the wider co-op movement can be in the stakeholder bits. I've sent that to everyone on the LFHC thing. I can put it on the chat about this on the Facebook group too. But that's if you want to get involved and just talk about things that affect you. Because when they pass regulations about housing associations, they affect us too. And some of the housing caps for bigger houses, when we talk about rents, are actually much lower than you would think there would be. It's not just a cap on the increases, there are overall caps. And essentially the cap on, as if bedrooms get bigger, the cap goes up by £10 a week for each room in a property. So in London, that makes a hell of a difference when a 5-bedroom house rents for less than the average bed set. And that probably means that I don't think any more 5 or 6 bedroom social homes are going to get built for the next 10 or 20 years. Because the system that's being set up to protect them could well be preventing people doing it. Does that make sense? And then nobody knows, nobody's got the answer. Does that include a shared house? If you're doing a shared house or on a single tenancy, could be 5 young people sharing. Does the rent cap apply? I don't know. Nobody seems to know.
Right. I see no more questions, no more comments. I'll just comment on the Guardian thing. I was sitting at work on Tuesday and I got a call straight out of the blue from one of their marketing people. They're going around every housing organisation. They're going around every housing organisation they can find and asking them to sign up for their Guardian services. So it actually is quite a slick operation. Just something I don't think we need to sort of think about how we protect our short life co-ops from what is effectively a predatory organisation.
Yeah,
might be an agenda item for a future meeting. But I just thought I'd raise that comment.
So just to matter, Mick, what way are they selling themselves? What service they offer?
Well, the marketeer got on the phone. Could I speak to the buildings manager of a small co-op? There was just me and one other person in the office at the time, and well, employed by this co-op, and I just told him, yes, you speak to me, and then she went on to spiel about how they provide services. If we have any voids, vacancies, they provide a service to fill these voids. It takes time to get the work done. Which I found a bit disturbing. I mean, it probably needs short life co-ops need to think about, you know, forming liaisons with councils and even housing associations again, to make sure that they get sufficient supply of properties for their members. It might even be worthwhile going out to the private sector, but I think it's an issue that needs to be debated. How do we get marketing resources for short life co-ops?
But I guess just to say why I'm here, or so we're a small co-op. There's just 5. We've got 5 units, 5 flats in Tottenham, and we're very different, I think, in nature to the other co-ops in London Federation of Housing Co-ops. I think we came to a meeting maybe about 10 years ago, and so we bought our first property in sort of 2007, I think, just before the financial crisis. And then bought another one about 7 years ago, and we've housed our last member securely about 2 years ago. So we're kind of now looking out, possibly thinking about expanding our own co-op, but I guess probably, well, I don't know what's more likely. Also looking at how we might either seed fund other co-ops or help other people get housed in some kind of way. And I guess we saw like the annual report that you sent out last year that seemed to be, again, kind of moving along those kinds of lines. Thinking about how, you know, what can we do now? So I guess I don't really have a huge amount more to say than that, but just yeah, thinking about some of the things that you're coming up. You mentioned about the London Housing Panel, even the things around helping property guardians, thinking about just thinking of other ideas of how can we help help contribute towards the sort of solving or making some contribution towards the housing crisis. that's kind of where we're at, but I don't really have much more to say than that. But it's been really interesting hearing about everyone else's issues and yeah,
if you've seen in the report then, we're looking at different ways of pushing finance models. I mean, the banks have this massive advantage that they can look up the details for yourself. Don't take financial advice from me, but they can lend what, 4 times what they've actually got on deposit. So they can lend 4 people at 5% and make a profit even with inflation at 10%. Finding other ways of replicate that is quite a challenge for a movement like ours. And we're just trying to do it that we've with a loan stock model, lending things so that our assets are actually doing something useful and lending to people that wouldn't have borrowed that money otherwise, based on the confidence we have in the robustness of the co-op housing model. And the different groups that can be supported, and obviously then be used as recruiting for people that people want to stay in. Because not if people might live in a housing co-op for 5 years and then move out of London and want to buy their own house. That's fine, but it's having that option for people that want to stay in the movement. So you're welcome to take part. And we'll probably go and have a swift half of shandy somewhere else after this, so we'll carry on a general discussion. But
And again, the banks effectively are not passing on the interest rate rises to savers. We, as a movement, are extremely cash rich. We all have vast quantities of money in banks. Nobody is investing it in anything. We're actually losing money. The current rate of about 10% per annum in its value, because we don't do anything with it. Our reserves are huge, and probably an awful lot of them unnecessary for the running of the co-ops. The relevant co-ops. We should look at investing that either primarily in helping expand our existing co-ops or setting up new ones. With that said,
CCH did continue to discuss this idea of, because that dominant old David Rogers co-op housing fund is still going, and there's 70 grand knocking about, which Blaze has agency over. But the idea of reinflating that and looking at coming up with some sort of vehicle that ordinary co-ops could invest in. So this idea that Greg and Mick have talked about of collectivizing our assets would have some sort of framework was discussed at the last meeting, and I think that's becoming more of a priority. Since the old community housing fund initiative seemed to be collapsing, and the tripartite thing with the CLTs seems to have run into its buffers. So it's the idea that we do something ourselves, really.
well, I mean, when I was on CCH, I remember it came up again. We need to, I think, engage in a process before you start this in educating members of our committees and members of the co-ops on basic finance, and that why it is stupid to keep huge amounts of cash. It's equivalent to sticking it under your mattress and leaving it there for 30 years. It loses its value, and it's worth far smaller amount when you actually come to use it. It should be invested from day one. John, you had a hand up?
Just that we could all retrofit our homes, for instance. I think we can lead the way on that to the front. Housing associations aren't going to do that.
No.
But co-ops would not, especially that inspirational sort of presentation from Charlie Baker, for instance. I think we could move forward on that. We could be at cutting edge of green technology.
I think that's a very good idea.
I think so. I will bring that.
Our money, so we can employ people, and we could be. It's a win-win situation. As far as I'm concerned.
We can connect with the community energy co-ops. I attend Community Energy London every month, which is well worth going to, and we can connect with these organisations. We encourage our co-ops to do stuff, and there is grant money out there, the social housing decarbonisation, which I wonder, Martin, if you could give how did CCH's social housing decarbonisation grant application go?
Well, the last thing they got the threshold, didn't they? They got the 100 units. I think Vine pitched in with the last 7 or 8, etc. Last report we had back was that having jumped that threshold, they're waiting to hear whether they're going to be, and there wasn't any update at the last board meeting. That was about, what, 3 or 4 weeks ago. But fingers crossed. But yeah, hopefully you would think somebody might be sensible and give them a shot at it. And it'd be interesting to see. I think almost all of us would be interested to see what the, how that goes, because it, it really points to a big chunk of work in the future, really, isn't it? So,
well, for the next 18 months anyway, till the change of regime, it'll be the only grant available. But then the individual councils have grants available for this as well, and the GLA has grants available for this as well. So it's something we need to publicise and encourage members to get. I think Waverley D8 got a grant from Islington Council to do stuff. Number of grants from Islington Council to do retrofit and stuff, and they can be a practical example.
Yeah. You can show people around, say this is what can happen. But I think that's a good idea. But we need 140,000 people, and we need to do 1 million houses every year.
Yeah.
So that's the big challenge.
What?
Like that,
Yeah, no, I'm going to leave in a minute.
Oh, I think we've reached the end of the meeting. So I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. And for the people in the room here, we will adjourn to somewhere pleasant for a brief split half, etc., or a sarsaparilla. And hopefully see you all at our next forum meeting, which I think we're going to try and schedule for May.
Yes.
Yeah.
Last Saturday in May.
Right. Yeah.
I was gonna say, it has to be somewhere late now because we're all busy, aren't we? We're not enjoying the